All right, that was the Marine Corps analysis, and again, this is all from the same manual. But I'm gonna go into so they covered what the Marine Corps analysis had, and now this is the U.S. Army Infantry School analysis. This is Russian Army lessons learned from the Battle of Grozny. You need to culturally orient your forces so you don't end up being your own worst enemy simply out of cultural ignorance. Many times, Russian soldiers made serious cultural errors in dealing with the Chechen civilians. Once insulted or mistreated, the Chechens became active fighters, or at least supported the active fighters. Russians admit they underestimated the effect of religion on the conflict. So you got to know your enemy, and you got to know your friends. And this is something that they definitely make that important in the U.S. military, that, you got to understand the local culture. And there was a true hero named Travis Patriquin, who we will have to do a show on at some point. But Travis Patriquin was with us over in Iraq, in Ramadi, and he was just incredibly smart guy and a former SF guy. He became a captain in the Army, and he spoke Arabic, and he's the guy really that started saying, look, this is what we got to do to make friends with these locals. And he ended up producing this actually pretty famous PowerPoint brief that just had a bunch of stick figures of, hey, this is the local guy, this is what he sees you as, this is what you see him as, but this is what he really is, and this is what, and it was a great document, a very simple document. Brilliant in its simplicity, in the way it explained it, and it ended up being circulated all over the place. And that was written by a guy named Travis Patriquin, who's just, again, a hilarious guy, very nice guy, and really had a vision of and a full understanding of the Arabic culture, the tribal culture, the sheikhs that were there in Ramadi. And he did an amazing job moving that whole scene and that whole piece of the battle. He did an amazing job moving us forward and making sure that we were culturally oriented to understand the locals. And unfortunately, after we left Ramadi and they were still there, Captain Patriquin, Travis Patriquin, was in a vehicle. I think he was heading south on a road called Sunset and hit an IED, and he was killed in action. And it was a tragic loss of an incredible, not only incredible soldier, but just an incredible human. Someday we'll go into some more depth about Travis Patriquin, because he really had a huge impact. Next bullet point, you need some way of sorting out combatants from non-combatants. The Russians were forced to resort to searching the pockets of civilians for military equipment and to sniffing them for the smell of gunpowder and gun oil. This was crude and not very reliable. Trained dogs were used to detect the smell of gunpowder or explosives, but were not always effective. Nevertheless, specially trained dogs are probably the best way to determine if a person has been using explosives or firing a weapon recently. What was good for us was, working alongside the Iraqi soldiers, they could tell. They could tell where people were from. They could tell where their accent was from. They could tell with a couple questions.
Who could tell?
The Iraqi soldiers, when we went to speak to some random Iraqi civilians,
they could
tell.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be able to tell in a million years.
Right.
Just like if you took an Iraqi and transplanted him here and put him in a room with a guy from New Jersey and a guy from Southern California and a guy from Georgia, they wouldn't be able to tell where any of these people were from. But any American could talk to any of those three people and immediately know where they were from.
Yeah, gotcha.
So we used the Iraqi soldiers to help us with that, and also our interpreters. We had, interpreters that were fluent in the language and generally came from either Iraq or some other Arabic-speaking country, and so they had the same knowledge and they could do the same thing. The psychological impact of high-intensity urban combat is so intense, units should maintain a large reserve that will allow them to rotate units in and out of combat. If a commander does this, he can preserve a unit for a long time. If he doesn't, once it gets used up, it cannot be rebuilt. So that statement about the psychological impact of high-intensity urban combat. And there's so many little things that make this true. You know, I already talked about the 360-degree threat. There's the IED. There's the civilian populace. There's the close-in fighting. There's all these things that make urban combat the most intense kind of combat, psychologically. And you have to be careful with your troops to make sure that you give them enough time out of the fight that they can maintain a long deployment in that sort of intensity. And the Russians did not always do a very good job of that. Next bullet. Training and discipline are paramount. You can accomplish nothing without them. You may need to do the training in the combat zone. Discipline must be demanded. Once it begins to slip, the results are disastrous. That is something I believe in across the board.
I think you mentioned that before too, by the way.
I may have mentioned that a few times. And there it is again. Training and discipline are paramount. Discipline must be demanded. Once it begins to slip, the results are disastrous. You have to hold the line on the discipline. You have to. The Russians were surprised and embarrassed at the degree to which the Chechens exploited the use of cell phones, Motorola radios, improvised TV stations, lightweight video cameras, and the internet to win the information war. The Russians admitted that they lost control of the information coming out of Grozny early in the operation and never regained it. As expected, the Russians reiterated the need for large numbers of trained infantrymen. They said that some tasks, such as conducting log pack, that's logistics, operations could only be conducted by infantrymen. The logistical unit soldiers were hopelessly inept at basic military skills such as perimeter defense, establishing security overwatch, and so forth, and thereby fell easy prey to the Chechens. So that's something that our troops in America have really done an outstanding job of adapting to the logistics support people being combat ready. Because every time if you're a supply guy in the Army and you got to bring whatever it is, water, food, ammunition from Baghdad to Ramadi, that means you're doing a combat patrol. That means you could likely get attacked. Yeah. And so America did a really good job of getting their folks trained up to run these convoys. And, the logistics teams that supplied the warfighters, the frontline troops, they came under all kinds of attacks and did an outstanding job. So all you folks that are listening that were running those logistics convoys, thank you. And you did an outstanding job, and I know there was huge risk every time you rolled out the front gate. Next bullet. They found that boundaries between units were still tactical weak points, but that it wasn't just horizontal boundaries that they had to worry about. In some cases, the Chechens held the third floor and above, while the Russians held the first two floors and sometimes the roof. If a unit holding the second floor evacuated parts of it without telling the unit on the ground floor, the Chechens would move troops in and attack the ground floor unit through the ceiling. Often this resulted in fratricide as the ground floor unit responded with uncontrolled fire through all of the ceilings, including the ones below that section of the building still occupied by the Russians. Entire battles were fought through floors, ceilings, and walls without visual contact. That's got to be scary, right?
Yeah.
Ambushes were common. Sometimes they actually had 3 tiers. Chechens would be underground, on the ground floor, and on the roof. Each group had a different task in the ambush. The most common response by the Chechens to the increasingly powerful Russian indirect and aerial firepower was hugging the Russian unit. The hugging tactics caused the Russians to if the hugging tactic caused the Russians to cease artillery and air fires, it became a man-to-man fight, and the Chechens were well equipped to win it. If they didn't cease the supporting fires, the Russian units suffered just as much as the Chechen fighters did, sometimes even more, and the morale effect was much worse on the Russians. So it's very simple. If the enemy is going to use, or if the Russians are going to use big bombs and big artillery and big bombs from the sky to defeat us, we'll just get so close in. We'll just close the distance and be so close that if you want to drop bombs, you're going to kill your own people. Yeah. Both the physical and mental health of the Russian units began to decline almost immediately upon initiation of high-intensity combat. In less than a month, almost 20% of the Russian soldiers were suffering from viral hepatitis, which is a very serious, debilitating, with slow recovery. Most had chronic diarrhea and upper respiratory infections that turned to pneumonia easily. This was blamed on the breakdown of logistical support that meant units had to drink contaminated water. Unit sanitary discipline broke down almost completely. So that discipline, like I said, it starts with the shaving, and then the next thing you know, you're not boiling your water, and the next thing you know, you're sick, and the next thing you know, you're crapping all over the place, and the next thing you know, you're making other people sick. And it starts with the discipline. Mm-hmm. According to a survey of over 1,300 troops, these are Russian troops, made immediately after the fighting, about 72% had some sort of psychological disorder. Almost 75% had an exaggerated startle response. That's like when there's a loud noise and you shudder from it. So 75% had an exaggerated startle response. 28% had what was described as neuroemotional, and almost 10% had acute emotional reactions. The Russians recommended 2 psychophysiologists, 1 psychopharmacologist, 1 psychiatrist, and 1 medical psychologist at each U.S. corps-sized unit. That's a huge recommendation for mental health. Although their experience in Afghanistan prepared them somewhat for the physical health problems, they were not prepared for this level of mental health treatment. Many permanent combat-stressed casualties resulted from soldiers not being provided proper immediate treatment. Again, this boils down to how harsh that urban combat is. And they were not ready for it. They were not ready for the psychological damage that urban combat does to the soldier's mind. How it gets in the head, and you've got the startle response and the emotional acute reactions. It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare.
That acute emotional reactions, that's like like what they'll
Right.
break down.
Breaking down. Yeah, breaking down.
easy. Dang.
Chechens weren't afraid of tanks or BMPs, and BMP is like a Bradley fighting vehicle. It's basically an armored personnel carrier for the most part with a big gun on top. They assigned groups of RPG gunners to fire volleys at the lead and trail vehicles. Once these were destroyed, others were picked off one by one. Oh, this is Battle of Grozny, some facts. The Russian forces lost 20 of 26 tanks, 102 of 120 BMPs in the first 3 days of fighting. Yeah. So imagine you got a convoy of 12 vehicles with a tank in the front and a tank in the back, and the Chechens take out the front and back. So now guess what? You're stuck. And then they just sit there and pick off the rest of the vehicles.
Ducks.
This is also important. Chechens chose firing positions high enough or low enough to stay out of the fields of fire of the tank and BMP weapons. So, the angle of fire can only go so high and so low, so they just stayed out of those two angles. Russian conscript infantry sometimes refused to dismount and often died in their BMP without ever firing a shot. So this is a nightmare. Your vehicle gets hit, and if you know anything, when your vehicle gets hit or like your convoy gets hit, get out. In other words, if the vehicle can't move because it's trapped by other vehicles or it's trapped by the road or it's trapped by whatever, get out of the vehicle. Get out of the vehicle and take down a building. Get out of the vehicle and move to cover. Get out of the vehicle. The vehicle's just a bullet magnet at that point and an RPG magnet. So just get out of there. Russian elite infantry did much better, but didn't coordinate well with armored vehicles initially. So I can tell you that we coordinated with the armored vehicles beautifully, and we loved them. We loved the U.S. Army armor that we worked with. Absolutely loved them, and we coordinated with them, and we worked together with them in a beautiful manner. Chechens were brutish, especially with prisoners. Some reports say the Russians were no better, but most say that the Chechens were the worse of the two sides. Whoever was at fault, the battle degenerated quickly to one of no quarter asked, none given. Russian wounded and dead were hung upside down in the windows of defended Chechen positions. Russians had to shoot at the bodies to engage the Chechens. Russian prisoners were decapitated, and at night, their heads were placed on stakes beside the roads leading into the city, over which Russian replacements and reinforcements had to travel. So, you don't think of that in this day and age. That's something you read about in the history books. Right. You remember it from the history books. But there it is. I mean, this is 1994, 1995, 1996. Heads on stakes. Both Russian and Chechen dead were routinely booby-trapped. The Russians were not surprised by the ferocity and brutality of the Chechens, but they were surprised by the sophistication of the Chechen use of booby traps and mines. Chechens mined and booby trapped everything, showing excellent insight into the actions and reactions of the average Russian soldier. Mine and booby trap awareness was hard to maintain. And as you look at this more, I mean, they booby trapped anything that they talk about. How they showed insight into the actions and reactions of the average Russian soldier. They knew what would attract them. They knew what they couldn't keep their hands off of, and that's what they'd booby trap. Some little shiny object, something that looked expensive or something that looked worthwhile. It was booby trapped.